So, this is Mark Abell here on another episode of Green Philosophy. And today I'm going to be talking to Matthew Huber. He's the Director of Graduate Studies for Geography at Syracuse University. And he brings a Marxist lens to environmental issues. How are you today, Matthew?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, what brought your interest in Marxism?
I remember early on in college kind of becoming pretty radicalized around environmental crisis, sort of feeling like the system was really unsustainable. There was major problems that had to be overhauled. And around the same time, I kind of got exposed to I read the Communist Manifesto and got exposed to a kind of Marxist critique of capitalism, which seemed to really get to the core of the sort of structural or systemic problems with capitalism that I thought mapped on pretty well to explaining the ecological crisis. And so around that time, I discovered there was already, this was about the year 2000, way back in the day. I discovered there was a whole kind of already a body of thought on ecological Marxism, and I got exposed particularly to a journal called Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism, which was hashing out a lot of these debates. And I got pretty convinced that, yeah, we needed this kind of anti-capitalist politics to actually deal with the ecological crisis.
So how does inequality play into this?
Well, the main thing I see today is it's really inequality, not in the kind of income sense that we tend to think about it. Like there's this kind of inequality of income and wealth, and you can kind of crunch the numbers and see a lot of money going to the top 1%. That's all important, but as a Marxist, I've become more and more convinced we need to see this as inequality of power and control over our productive systems that, produce everything we need in life: food, energy, housing, all the stuff that everyday people need to survive are controlled by a very small minority of capitalists who control those sectors for profit. And it's really, that's where I've sort of settled on the real issue of inequality is that it's really this small group of people who have such unequal amounts of control over our relationship with nature. The fact is, the vast majority of us have very little control over how the stuff we need in life is produced, how the food gets to our plate, how the energy gets to our homes. It's basically we're completely alienated from those decisions. We're completely removed from those systems so much that we don't even often think about them. But if we start to think about them, we see they are, in fact, controlled by this tiny elite of corporations and capitalists. And so that's where we really need to focus our energy on, is confronting those capitalists who control those systems. And it's also their control over it for profit that is leading to all these environmental problems, because oftentimes the more environmentally disastrous forms of production they embark on, the more profits they make. So they actually can make more money by cutting corners on environmental protection, on emitting more waste and pollution, and not installing more expensive pollution control technologies, and so forth and so on. So that seems to me, for the environmental issue, seems to be the main problem of inequality. It's inequality of control over production. And, inequality of income and consumption does matter. We have very rich people that fly private jets and eat steak twice a week, drive Hummers. But to me, that's secondary to the inequality of of control over how we actually produce, the actual relationship with nature, which is at the core of this kind of Marxist analysis, is really pinpointing how we produce our livelihood on a societal scale.
So if you were going to have a conversation with a coworker, kind of a water cooler conversation about what Marxism is, what would you tell them?
Well, on the one hand, it's a sort of philosophy of history that is often called historical materialism. And when he says materialism, I've sort of started arguing that actually when he says materialism, he means, a philosophy of history that takes ecology as the core of history, in the sense that human beings need to eat, they need housing, they need various material things to reproduce themselves as a society. And so Marx and Engels believe that you really have to put that material basis of human life at the core of how we analyze how history develops. So he came up with all these sort of ideas to think about how do different modes of production develop over history, and how do those modes of production have different political systems of control and exploitation and hierarchy. And that eventually led him to identify the capitalist mode of production, which was really exploding at the time in which he was writing, which he differentiated from previous modes of production like feudalism and the exploitation of serfs, or the slave mode of production, exploitation of slaves. And he really identified capitalism as a system based on kind of generalized commodity production and exchange, where the vast majority of people are actually forced to work for money to survive rather than have some sort of relationship with the land, or some peasant-based relationship with actual subsistence production. Capitalism is different because most people are torn from the land and they're forced to sell their labor for money to survive. And so as he started to identify this issue with capitalism, he started to develop a pretty significant critique of capitalism and how it operates. And he identified for a number of things, but one of which is the way in which production is geared towards profit and making money, which is, again, somewhat historically new. You had a lot of previous modes of production that really focused on producing lots of wealth for elites, but capitalism was really the first where the real goal was not just material wealth or accumulating lots of stuff like gold or spices, but actually to accumulate money and to make profit and money making the core driving force of all production. And Marx identifies how that narrow-minded imperative of money making and accumulation of money really creates all these, sort of pathologies in the capitalist system. The fact that you can kind of accumulate money, there's no end to it. It's just sort of infinite amount of accumulation when you're just trying to make as much money as possible. And of course, money is also highly abstracted from the material relationship we have with nature. So when the people driving this system are only focused on money, they're very disconnected from the ecological systems that are required for life. But the other really important thing he identified was that if you really want to understand how these capitalists are making all this money, he believed you had to actually look at what he called the exploitation of labor in the what he called the hidden abode of production, where capitalists extract surplus value from forcing workers to work longer hours or forcing them to be more efficient or more productive. And this kind of unpaid labor, he said capitalists were extracting as profit from the living labor of workers themselves. So this theory of exploitation was something he really contributed to debates at the time in political economy where no one really understood where this profit was coming from, and he kind of said it's actually from brutal, inhumane exploitation of workers that he was witnessing in England at the time, but you can see around the world today in various horrific, inhumane, exploitative labor regimes, whether in garment factories in Bangladesh or iPhone factories in China, whatever it might be. But the core profit from a Marxist perspective is that exploitation of labor. Finally, he believed that capitalism also had these incredible capacities to innovate and develop what he called the productive forces, which actually created all this technological innovation and competition between capitalists to innovate more technological innovation. And he thought that this relentless, innovative system would create such material capacities for abundance that it would create the possibility materially for abolishing poverty and creating a post-capitalist society or socialist society that could not only give everyone enough food and enough of the material necessities of life, but also really abolish a lot of the work that is necessary to reproduce society. So his vision of freedom was very much a freedom from labor, freedom from work, and the cliche was, he said that we would philosophize in the morning, we would fish in the afternoon, we would do whatever we want. It would be sort of true freedom as in free time, because basically we'd be able to handle all the necessary aspects of production in very little time due to all this abundance that capitalism has produced for us.
So did you see that book, The 4-Hour Workweek? Are you familiar with that at all?
I feel like I've heard about it, but not specifically that book, no.
So that guy, he was a Princeton dropout, and he had all different types of hobbies, whether it was mixed martial arts or world travel or all kinds of things. And I would say he took the 4-hour work week and made it a capitalist idea of, now I'm only going to work 4 hours because I'm a wealthy entrepreneur, and I'm going to have virtual assistants in India that can do this work, for dollars per hour. But I think if we appropriated that idea as socialists, like as you said, capitalism has an enormous productive capacity, and we can produce housing for everybody very easily. We can produce food for everybody very easily. We can produce clothing for everybody very easily. So, the leisure society I envision is, we can set up thousands of hammocks in the parks, and we can read all kinds of books, and we can spend our days doing yoga, and we can spend our days riding our bikes or rollerblading or having dance parties or whatever it is that we want to do. But what's actually happened in the United States especially is our work weeks have increased, because now the technological innovation of email or social media or the cloud, you would think, now I can do work from anywhere. But then the bosses just say, why don't you take more work home with you now?
Yeah.
So what might some workplace organizing look like on some of these issues?
Well, that's another thing Marx showed very well, is that things like that, the length of the working day, are not just like objective numbers that people come up with, but are products of social struggle and class struggle. So he has a whole chapter in Capital about capital's sort of unrelenting desire to push workers to work longer and longer hours, back in England in the 16-hour work days, and how the workers actually had to organize and struggle to get that lower. And in the time there was a big fight over like the 10-hour a day, 10 hours bill it was called. And of course you probably have seen a bumper sticker that says something like, union movement, the people that brought you the 8-hour workday, the people that brought you weekends, But this still is a problem, as you suggest, with social media, with the digital economy. The lines between life and work are becoming more blurry for some workers. And so actually there's been struggles over this. I often tell my students that a few years ago in France, they actually had to pass a law that made it illegal for employers to fire workers for not responding to communications at ridiculous hours, which before they could fire their workers if they didn't respond to an email at 8:30 at night or 9 o'clock at night or whatever it might be. So they actually had to organize as workers and to get that law passed, which made that illegal for employers to fire them for that. So German workers have been struggling, I believe, in the steel industry or metalworks or something. They're actually struggling for a 28-hour a week work week. Now, I think you mentioned 4 hours a week. that would be very a small number of hours for a work week. But one thing Marx is clear on is that it's probably impossible to eliminate all necessary labor. So there's going to be, especially if you think about socialism as essentially more democracy over how production is organized, there's going to be a lot of labor doing that. A lot of labor. Democracy takes a lot of labor. So we want to try to find a happy medium. We don't want socialism to be endless meetings, endless discussion and deliberation over how much food do we need, how much housing do we need. But we also want to make those systems very democratic in how the decisions are made over how they look, and that's the key. So there's a new book. I can have it right here, and it's called The People's Republic of Walmart, which talks about how Walmart has been harnessing all this incredible information technology and computerization and digitalization to really automate a lot of the systems that run their supply chains. And they argue in the book that those types of highly automated supply chain systems, if they were actually appropriated for social good and social need, and not just for the Walton family, they could, these incredibly efficient supply chain type systems could be the kind of automated socialist productive system that could be really efficient so that it would create more time to deal with those types of democratic questions, but also, more importantly, to free up society to do the things we want to do, which is what you mentioned, things like art and music and things that are just really fulfilling apart from the brutal necessity of having to reproduce our society. Yes.
So how do you think, how can we shake up some of the complacency of our coworkers? So I had an experience. I worked at Cabela's. I don't know if you're familiar with the hunting store. And I worked there, and the research I found was that company does about $4 billion a year worth of sales. And so it's a pretty profitable company. And a lot of my coworkers are Trump supporters, right-wing, conservative. Just as long as we have our guns, that's all we need. And a lot of them, work 40, 50, 60 hours a week at minimum wage. And they had all kinds of debt, debt for ATVs, debt for pickup trucks, debt for snowmobiles, debt for motorboats, debt for rifles, the whole 9 yards. And a lot of them felt as long as they had their credit cards, as long as they had their home equity line of credit, as long as they had their basically the capacity to borrow money for their man toys, they didn't have, they were pretty complacent with, this is all right. What's the problem? We don't need a union. Is there, how do we shake things up a bit and help them to see, some reform could be useful?
There is a question of how representative those particular workers are for the entire working class under capitalism. I think what my general sense is that most people working in those types of service sector, low wage, retail type sectors, my sense is like most of them are not Trump supporters or any supporters. They're just sort of not political. They're not into politics. They don't see why politics would even be worth their time. And I think that's a very rational approach for working class people, because we've had a political system for decades now that has basically been completely bought by that 1% I was mentioning before that controls everything in our society, everything, all those productive systems. But you're certainly going to find a part of the working class that is sort of really, I guess, embedded in what other Marxists would talk about as sort of hegemony of the capitalist system, where they really do buy into a lot of the logics of capitalism. I've only written one book. I'm trying to write a second one, but the first one is basically about this, and it's about oil and how oil really powers the way of life, particularly in suburban types of context, where it's so privatized and it's so atomized and isolating that people kind of really do start to believe that they're on their own, and there's really no such thing as society. There's no need for politics, no need for collective organization or solidarity or public systems of provision, that everyone's just sort of on their own. And that's what oil helped power, is this highly spread out, isolated, privatized society. And I argue that power that oil provided to kind of spread everyone out and isolate them from each other really provided the political populist energy behind the kind of rightward shift of our politics that started around 1980 with Ronald Reagan, where he was saying, government is not the solution, it's the problem. We need to cut taxes, we need to slash the whole public sector and really destroy the public basis of society itself. So you're going to get a lot of that from a lot of people, and particularly in the United States, which is a highly individualistic society. But on the other hand, I think we are in a moment right now where a lot of working class people are starting to understand the depravity of our system, the inequality of our system, and the fundamental unfairness of it. And so I think something like the Bernie Sanders campaign is really channeling a lot of that working class anger at the 1%, at the way, sooner or later, you can take out a lot of credit, but sooner or later, debt can be an extremely stressful and destructive force on people's lives and family lives and communities and things like this. So, Bernie's announced like the top people contributing to his campaign right now are people that work at Walmart, that work in Amazon warehouses, that are teachers. So he's really energizing at least part of his base from this kind of low-wage working class people that can starting to see very clearly that our society doesn't have to be this way, that we actually are the richest country in the world, and if we actually had political power coming from the bottom, we could push the elites to sacrifice to the extent that we could start to build up more of that, idea that we live in a society. We need to, share resources. We need to have public systems like every other industrialized country in the world has, like national healthcare systems where people get healthcare as a right and not as a privilege, and those sorts of things. He's proposing things like eliminating student debt entirely, which is another big stressful system where a lot of banks and a lot of financial institutions are profiting. A lot of universities, including my own, are profiting from this huge amount of debt being put on to student shoulders. But, I think Bernie and others are starting to articulate, like, what if we lived in a society where education was a human right, including college education, which most people think is necessary in this kind of knowledge economy to have much of a chance at what this is sort of capitalist ideology, but opportunity for advancement and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's reason to be a little more hopeful, although there's a lot of work to be done to wake up a lot of working class people to the possibility that politics is something that can improve their lives.
So there was some collusion recently between Amazon management and the Indiana government in terms of covering up a crane fell on one of the workers, and then no damages were paid out to the family, and the Indiana government, in exchange for some benefit from Amazon, I'm not sure what particular benefit, they chose to not investigate, and they closed the investigation. Can you speak more to that incident?
Well, that's just, that's how our economy has been run recently, where elected officials, particularly at the local level, are so kind of beholden to the investor class. So I don't know if these Indiana officials were doing this because they were, kind of like worried that any criticism of Amazon could threaten the jobs that Amazon has brought to their community and things like this. But the other thing is Amazon has created a business strategy that's very similar to Walmart, which is the goal is to kind of slash prices as low as humanly possible to kind of build up goodwill amongst consumers, to make consumers feel like they need this thing, like Amazon or Walmart. But to do that, they have to brutally push down wages, but also create these hyper inhuman systems of efficiency in their warehouses or in their supply chains to create these incredibly cheap production systems that deliver those lower prices to consumers. So when you do this brutally efficient organization of work in the warehouse, you're going to have a lot of accidents, like a crane falling and people getting injured at work. I've heard a lot of stories of Amazon warehouse workers that the warehouse is just horrifically hot, and they have ambulances that are forced to come and rescue overheated or heat exhausted workers. A lot of workers in Amazon warehouses complain that they aren't even able to take breaks to use the bathroom, and they are surveilled in the workplace, so that even if they wanted to go to the bathroom, they couldn't because they'd be fired. So there's a sort of dark side to this wonderful consumer world that we sort of interact with our Amazon Prime packages and our videos and things like that. It seems all fun and wonderful, but beneath, again, going to that hidden abode that Marx talked about, you see just this brutal, dehumanizing labor process. And again, because workers are so beaten down, unions have been crushed over the last 30 years. And as you were talking about, because workers are kind of many times buy into these very individualistic ideologies that think like, why would I want a union? It's not, I just want to focus on me type of ideology. This creates such a society in which basically capital rules over all of us. So the elected officials in Indiana are probably just thinking about who reproduces their own power, and that's corporations like Amazon. So they don't want to upset them. They don't want to bother them. And the only times elected officials feel like going up against these types of corporations are when there are mass movements amongst their constituents to force them to do so. So that happened in New York City, where Amazon was going to locate its second headquarters in New York, but you had this huge mobilization of workers and grassroots community activists all throughout New York City that basically said, we don't want this massive tax breaks to Amazon to come bring low-wage jobs to our community and destroy a lot of our public systems in the process. So you need those mass movements to kind of push back on the way in which capital has completely captured our entire society.
So Christopher Hedges, he wrote a book called The Death of the Liberal Class, and the premise there is just that from about the 80s on, as you said, in the 80s, we saw a destruction of unions. It also coincided with people that were intelligent, people that were ambitious, people that wanted maybe a better life for their family. The moral backbone diminished, and many professionals that would have advocated on behalf of the working class, journalists, professors, doctors, attorneys, nonprofit managers, these type of professional knowledge workers that had advocated on behalf of the working class, let's say from the 30s through the 70s, they realized there's a fork in the road, and if I have a moral backbone and I advocate for the working class, I'm missing out on a directorship for NIH in DC. It's $250,000 a year. I get a nice house in Bethesda. I get $50,000 BMW. I get my kids at $50,000 a year American University or $50,000 a year boarding schools, and the moral backbone is going to be too costly to my social advancement. I guess my question is, now the other side of this was intellectuals. I believe there's one professor for New York University, and he writes kind of a humanitarian perspective on Israeli degradation of the Palestinian people. And this professor, he has a PhD. He's very ambitious. He's written one of the best books on, humanitarian conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. He cannot achieve anything more than a $17,000 a year adjunct position. He has a moral backbone. He's produced one of the best books on the topic. But the United States government wants to give money to Israel. They want to support the political lobby of Israel. And so he's considered, a thorn in the side of the establishment, and it negatively impacts his career. So the takeaway here was Chris Hedges thought, if you have a moral backbone, be prepared to be marginalized, be poor. You may have a PhD from the best university in the world. You may produce the best reviewed books in the world. You're about to be very poor and very marginal. Like, to what extent have you seen that?
It's tough. I mean, on the one hand, the kind of first of all, I agree with the kind of basically the professional class, and this is something I write about in the ecological politics for the working class piece. Basically, I argue the professional class kind of adopted this type of politics that sit pretty perfectly with capitalist ideology, and particularly this post-1970s neoliberal ideology, which I argue is basically all about, like, we need to tighten our belts and accept less, which fit really well with these kind of anxious professional class sort of environmentalists who thought also, like, we're consuming too much, so we need less, and so forth. But overall, I think whether you're talking about the Democratic Party or the sort of power elite more broadly, the professional class is more sort of cozied up to those people in power than adopted a kind of politics that could stem this attack that was happening on the working class for the last 40 years. So while this is also happening, you have a huge process of what we call the corporatization of the university, where this idea that we have these professors that have things like tenured jobs, which is one of the more sort of stunning versions of workers that have achieved a kind of level of job security through a kind of struggle. Actually, there's a long history of how tenure was sort of won by professors. But basically, universities have decided, well, this costs too much money. We don't want too many of these professors running around that we can't even fire. So they have shifted a lot of their teaching labor to these very precarious, low wage, like you said. A lot of them are making no more than $17,000 a year to teach at these incredibly wealthy institutions like my own. And it creates this incredible divide between those on the tenure track and the huge masses of very precarious low-wage adjuncts and other low-wage teaching labor at universities. Now, I would say that even among the more privileged tenured stream faculty, there are a fair amount of people that I would say, hopefully I can include myself, have like a moral backbone and are really good political people. I know a lot of colleagues of mine who are strong organizers on basically Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice, just to give that one example, but on any number of other human rights, climate justice. There's tons of incredible, what you would, that's sort of a trendy name, if people say scholar activists, or people that are scholars but also really embedded themselves in huge social movements and struggles. And so there's a lot of people that I feel like are academics, and they're on the right side of these fights. Certainly there's a lot that aren't, and there's a lot that are more, academia creates a lot of structural forces that convince people to be completely focused on kind of this very narrow-minded, like careerist, again, I'm going to focus on me and on individual advancement, and that can really kind of take over a lot of academics' lives. But there are a fair amount. There is, in the 60s and 70s, while society was turning rightward, academia actually turned quite left, and there were all these radicals from the 60s and 70s that basically took over academia. And that was its own kind of struggle. So we do have a fair amount of good left-wing people, and I hate to sound so skewed in that way, but I mean people that are on the side of social justice and these types of struggles in the academic realm.
All right, I want to close with, what advice would you give to a 30-year-old version of yourself?
Be happy that you're 30 years old now, because when I was 30 years old, it was in the midst of the financial crisis, and like I said, I wrote this book called Lifeblood because it's basically about trying to understand how the right and how capital actually had so thoroughly won, right? How they had completely colonized our entire politics, so that even the so-called liberal party in the United States, the Democratic Party, was passing things like welfare reform and NAFTA and gutting unions, doing all the things that Reagan started doing in the 80s. So when I was 30, politics was just so far right, and the working class was so defeated, it just seemed utterly hopeless. But now, I do feel like there is a kind of rupture in society. Trump is itself evidence of the fact that the kind of neoliberal consensus of the last 40 years has collapsed, and people are so that system only favored the top, really only favored the top at best 10% of society. So you keep that system going for long enough, and the bottom 90% are going to start to be like, WTF, what is going on here? This is BS, because only a few people are getting rich and the rest of us are struggling mightily just to afford basic things like healthcare and food and heating and these types of things. So our totally horrific, rapacious, unequal capitalist system has led finally to a huge amount of anger and upsurge and I think hunger for something different. Now we're in a very dangerous moment because the populist right is offering a version of that different politics, and it's basically, we're going to sort of hammer down on nationalism, we're going to build walls, we're going to blame immigrants, and we're going to blame other people for other poor people generally for the problems that exist in society. And so that's one alternative. But I think, again, when I was 30, the fact that you could have a self-declared democratic socialist running for president, and actually he's got a real chance, like he's at the top of the polls, he's outraising everyone. Like I would have said, you're crazy. This is not possible. But now it is possible. So to me, it's very exciting political moment we're living in, because the neoliberal system has collapsed, there's a lot of open possibility. But I do feel that if we're not careful and we don't take advantage of if we don't really think about, like, because a lot of these professional class liberals are so sort of embedded in their bubbles, they aren't aware of how there's just, like, the bulk of society is really demanding change and an alternative from the status quo. And in my view, that change has to be either a really strong, bold left-wing vision or this sort of xenophobic right-wing vision. And so we can choose one of those paths in this moment of rupture. And so given that the left-wing path is possible, it makes it a really exciting time. So I would just say, be excited at the moment we're living in, and try to get involved in these political struggles if you can and you have the capacity, because we need all people, all hands on deck for this kind of struggle and movement at this moment.
So yeah, let's get all hands on deck. I thank you so much for your time, Matthew. It's been a total blast.
Awesome.
And I will be in touch.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for having me.